Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Picture two owners. They're in the same industry, approximately the same size company. Let's maybe call it $3 million in earnings. One sells for $12 million and spends the next 3 years as an employee inside of the business they used to own. The other one sells for $40 and is gone in just a few months. The difference wasn't the product, the customers, or the market. It was whether the business could run without them. I was fortunate enough to spend quite a few years on the buyer side of several of these deals. I was fortunate enough to come in on Monday morning after the deal was closed and not just take over for the previous owner or the previous leadership, but to really unpack what was just purchased. And I think ultimately that makes a pretty unique experience to be able to speak on this topic and the value of creating systems from this lens, right? The impact of an exit valuation. I think generally one of the things that kind of gets missed into this conversation is that the actual multiple that gets paid or the risk associated with the foundation of the business is kind of priced in like before, the offer ever hits the table, right? And it can seem counterintuitive or like the two things are kind of, one right after the other. But the reality is it's this foundation that is being built, right? This proactive decision making to develop these underlying systems and this underlying infrastructure that will ultimately impact you if and when it comes to exit. And when, not just to speak on the experience that I had kind of coming up, but when I left there acquiring a business and going through the due diligence process, helping some of my current clients go through the diligence process on a potential deal that they were investigating. That's what ultimately has informed, kind of my opinion on this topic. And again, some of the things that I saw would be deals structured as a earnout. So let's say a owner was willing to stay on board and the purchasing company didn't believe that there was enough systems and infrastructure, whether that was, at the individual contributor level, at the leadership level, from a pure technical perspective, right? There's a variety of lenses that these decisions are being, evaluated through, right? And again, often measured in risk, but what tends to happen, right, is an owner tends to be pretty optimistic in terms of what the value of their business is because they live in it every day. And so again, when you're an outside party evaluating that, and you may measure risk in a different way than a privately held business, you may throw an offer on the table that, is some type of an earnout to get to a multiple that makes the deal close. And I was fortunate to be a witness to some of those deals. And, you know, I think what ultimately on the buy side they are trying to do is to, hedge and mitigate risk, right? Because, it's a win-win from their perspective. They, get to lock up this deal. They only have to pay an additional multiple if certain milestones are hit. And I think on the sell side, it's attractive because you have a real incentive and you believe in the foundation that you've built. The challenge there, right, is generally an internal one for a variety of reasons, going from being an owner and having old decisions, ultimately square on your shoulders compared to becoming an employee of what you consider your own company and ultimately chasing, targets that you no longer control. And those are really difficult things to overcome, making that transition. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that I never saw an earnout be successful. But I think the other part of this I wanted to unpack about this specific, topic is just the fact that sometimes that is the first realization owners get that the infrastructure that they've built around them is not nearly as strong as they thought. And all that really means is, again, it's not impossible. It's not, you can't do it, right? Because I did it. I've routinely done it, when I was in that scenario with the company I acquired and, now for clients, right? So it's not an impossible mountain to climb. It's just that realization. And the buy side already recognized it, right? So back to what I said a couple of minutes ago in terms of like, the risk gets priced in before you ever see the offer. That's the reality of it, right? So while you may feel confident, it's kind of like put your money where your mouth is, because if you, ultimately exit your business on an earnout, if you can't figure out, if the infrastructure is not as strong as you thought and the buy side was correct, right, from that risk mitigation perspective, and you exited as an earnout, now the pressure's really on to start building out that infrastructure and get yourself to a point where the systems are able to, support hitting those milestones, right? So that's all that means. Some of the ways that, you can start to evaluate, this stuff and ultimately how I believe the buy side tends to evaluate this is, sure, they can look at your financials, but what they're really wanting to do is kind of get a peek at what's happening on, your shop floor. Right. So it's like the question to ask is if a buyer shadowed you on your, shop floor or throughout your operations for a day, like how much would they watch get routed through you? What decisions, what ultimately, kind of tasks, initiatives, what things are able to move forward without your purview? What kind of feedback loops have you built in across your company? Who are the other folks on the leadership team? How much trust has been built both at the leadership level and at the individual contributor level? Those are all things that will start to give you some signs in terms of, what kind of potential exit could you have, right? And I think it's a challenging thing to do. It requires you to take a non-biased look. And, let's be honest, that's why a lot of, owners that are interested in exit engage with either consultants or brokers to have them help see this. But the reality is, if you're able to have a non-biased look, you can do a lot of this stuff, right? You can be frank with yourself in terms of how much stuff does route through you. I shared a while ago this great exercise I like to do when we're, kind of in the early stages of figuring out, or I should say, helping leaders let go, right? And it's like this fire drill exercise where basically you, in increasing amount of time, you kind of step outside of the day to day, right? So it's like you can still be in the building, but you let everybody know, pretend I'm not here for, an hour, pretend I'm not here for 2 hours, pretend I'm not here for a day. What I want you to do is just keep track of, what you wanted to ask me, and then what your decision was. And then we're going to review that after the fact, right? It's a really easy way to start getting in the habit of letting go. And then you'll see the things that ultimately break, the things that do need your, consideration. But I'm guessing you'll be surprised by just how strong the people are around you. Now, the thing that ultimately gets kind of surfaced in that, right, is like the goal and the bounds. That's where I go back to my clarity, consistency, and accountability framework, because a lot of what you tend to see is that there isn't enough clarity. And then that's what starts to kind of erode trust. And that's what creates these dynamics where everything has to run, through you. Right. And again, keep in mind, we're talking about exit planning here. Right. So it's like the sooner you can start to do this, the sooner you can start to grow people across your team, the sooner you can start to optimize the systems that you already have and solve for real problems, right? And not just treat symptoms, the further off, the kind of further ahead that you will be. And ultimately, my argument is the greater, the multiple that you can achieve, right? So I think there is a correlation between, exactly how, strong the business is, if you will, as compare, directly correlates to, the multiple that you can stand to achieve, right? So, yeah. So, I would say another thing that I see is when owners are starting to think about an exit, or they're in the early stages of it. Maybe they're not thinking about an exit, but they're, getting tired and frustrated that things are running through them. One of the things I tend to see is that they try to fix that dependency by kind of cloning themselves, right? They hire that right-hand person. They start kind of, delegating everything to one person. And ultimately, while there are technically now two of you, you still have just continued to perpetuate the bottleneck, right? Everything still needs to run through one or two people. You've not built a system around that, right? You've not created any type of ability to disseminate that, information responsibilities across the infrastructure of your company, right? And so you're left with, what happens in the scenario that your right-hand person, or your left hand, right? But that person, wins the lottery and they're no longer available. What happens if some recruiter comes and poaches them? What happens if they're, so interested in entrepreneurship, they want to go and acquire their own business, right? And not maybe acquire your business, because I've seen that happen as well. Right. So don't get into the trap where you think cloning yourself or having that kind of right-hand person is the ultimate resolve for this. Because again, back to the exit planning, back to, how buyers are evaluating risk. A key person dependency is no different if they're a leader versus an owner. You still have the same dependency. So, and again, that stuff is easy to see when you're outside looking in through a variety of questions and interviews. And, again, not just necessarily taking a look at it through, through a financial lens, right? So, if you've been following me for any amount of time, when I talk about systems and systemizing and developing these things, right, I'm talking about 4 pillars. planning, people, process, and technology. It is the kind of, fundamental of how systems come together. And, there are layers of systems. You have, kind of the execution systems from the perspective of like each individual, element of the business requiring a system to, operate, right? But then you have the business as a whole. That is a system, right? How work moves through that system, how you deliver value to your customers or clients, right? So that's another important element where, again, I talk about this concept of, systems, kind of running by default versus by design. And that is because, somebody asked me this a couple of weeks ago on a LinkedIn post, is like, well, what do you do when when people don't already have, a system in place? But what they really meant is, what do they do when people don't have technology in place? And, my response was pretty simple. It's like, well, I mean, unless you're a startup business and you're literally figuring it out from zero, right? Everybody has systems, right? So it's like no system is the system. That's the default system, right? You've grown into this system that you're existing in today. That is what I mean by, living in the default, right? Like it is whatever it is today. And by design is understanding, like what are the root causes creating our problems, right? And solving those through that system lens, right? Planning, people, process, technology, right? You probably already have some sort of, enabler, right? From a tool perspective, but I'm guessing that you've not spent a lot of time in the planning element. I'm guessing that you've not optimized processes, right? And there's tribal knowledge and kind of workarounds that live through that. That's how we built our, default system, right? And then we're not bringing people in and utilizing, their collective brain power to improve the process and to ultimately get to a point where we've configured the tool to enable, right, our people and process. So for me, that's how all of this stuff connects. And again, what I tend to see out of people that are doing this is, again, more treating the symptoms. HubSpot, is terrible for a CRM. So you know what's going to fix that? We're going to implement Salesforce. And again, it has nothing to do with the tool. It has everything to do with the planning, people, process elements, right? Those workarounds that haven't been documented, the tribal knowledge that exists, the misconfiguration that has happened from one tool to another tool, right? So the other thing I think makes sense to talk about is that, you can't really fake this stuff. You can't do this stuff in 6 months, right? You can't reconfigure and systemize your entire business in 6 months. And if somebody's telling you that, I would say that they're just simply lying or just don't know. Right. The fact is, it's taken you a long time to get to this current state, this default system. And it's going to take some time to kind of walk out of that. Right. Because ultimately, there are a variety of things that you can do to, move the needle. But if you do those things in the wrong order, if you invest too much capital in the wrong thing, if you continue to solve for symptoms, right, you're really going to struggle to be attractive to that company that is potentially looking to acquire you. And if you have this 6-month or 12-month blitz of, continuous improvement and, we're going to change this and we're going to fix that and we're going to address that, it becomes short-lived. It's back to flavor of the month. And ultimately, again, through that diligence, through those interviews, those types of things are kind of easy to sniff out. And ultimately, what happens, right? Risk meter goes up, and it's like, boy, we thought we had this. Here's what reality is kind of looking like. Here's what I'm willing to offer you in terms of a multiple for your business, because a buyer is looking at that and saying, I'm going to have to do all of that. I'm going to have to make the hard decisions that, the previous ownership or leadership wasn't willing to make. I'm going to have to invest capital in, XYZ. We're going to have to, improve the flow so that we can get ourselves to a point that we are operationally sound, that we can go back out to market and say that our, lead times have decreased or our product quality has increased, right? So that's how these things ultimately get, evaluated. And, it's also important to mention, and I've talked about this previously, but, even if you're never selling, right? Like, this is all the same stuff, right? If you're struggling from a profitability perspective, if your cash flows are not what they'd like to be, if your culture sucks, right? If you're struggling to hire or retain top talent, right? That's all of this stuff, right? So you don't have to just exit it. And you don't have to just go after this idea of increasing your multiple because you want to exit it, right? Maybe you want to hand it down to the next generation, right? Maybe you want to turn it into an ESOP, right? Like maybe you just want to keep the thing for the next 30 years. Whatever the situation is, right? Kind of the answer is always the same, is the lesson I've learned after, doing this stuff for almost 30 years. Right. So I think, I like to talk about, great. What do, this is all great, Dave, like what do we do on Monday? Right. So if I'm thinking through it in that perspective, right, it's like my advice is the multiple is already being written, right? Like the multiple we're talking about exit multiples on this episode, right? So your multiple is being written every day. And every day that you decide that the status quo is okay is costing you in multiple. So just know that the decision you're making today is going to impact that multiple offer if and when the time comes, right? And ultimately, the faster you choose to start systemizing, with what I'll say is intentionally, right? By design, not by default. The sooner you do that, right? The faster your multiples will increase. And the faster your life will change, not just from a financial perspective, but from a mental health perspective and a capacity issue, right? So that's how I'd leave this. As a reminder, each one of the solo episodes is an extension of our Business System Saturday newsletter. So if you're getting any value out of this, I would encourage you to go check that out, sign up for it, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.